There's a question you ask yourself in silence, not when you're busy, not when there's noise, the one that shows up at night, or in the middle of a subway ride, or in those strange seconds just before you fall asleep. Why am I alive? And the curious thing isn't the question. The curious thing is what we do when it appears. We ignore it. We bury it under work, under scrolling, under anything that covers it up. Because deep down, we suspect the answer we were given wasn't the real one. Today we're going to look for the real one, and we're going to do it in two places nobody would expect to find together: the Bible, the most read book in history, and the mind of Baruch Spinoza, the philosopher who was expelled from his community for thinking too much. What I discovered when I studied them together left me speechless. At their core, both are telling the same story, a story that has been right in front of us for centuries, in plain sight, and that we haven't wanted to see. Stay until the end, because what's coming won't just surprise you. It could change the way you live starting tomorrow. First, we need to understand the starting point, the version we were sold. From the time we were children, the answer to "Why are we here?" was more or less this: to obey God, be good, and earn ourselves a place in paradise. A purpose that comes from outside, a mission assigned to you by a cosmic boss. And let's admit it, it sounds comfortable. You're given the map, the rules of the game, and the final prize. Be fruitful. Multiply. Dominate the earth. The first instructions of Genesis, a clear action plan. The purpose, according to this version, is simple. Fulfill your end of the contract. If you do, God fulfills his. But let's be honest, does that answer really fill you up? Feeling like an employee in a cosmic corporation, looking up at the sky, waiting for instructions, fearing punishment if you make a mistake. For many people, this idea doesn't feel like liberation. It feels like a cage, even if it's made of gold. And meanwhile, real life, the one you have here and now, slips through your fingers. This is the deception of obedience, the idea that your worth depends on pleasing something outside of you. But before you think I'm going to attack the Bible, wait, because the story takes a turn you won't see coming, and the turn comes from the Bible itself. Inside that same sacred book, there is a voice that dares to say, "Wait, all of this might be a lie." That voice is called Ecclesiastes. It's not a book of happy promises or victory hymns. It's the diary of a man who had everything: wisdom, wealth, power. A man who followed all the rules, who held up his end of the contract. And at the end of his life, he looks around and delivers one of the most devastating lines in history. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. In other words, smoke. Everything is smoke. He worked without rest. He accumulated fortune. He chased pleasure. He pursued wisdom. And his conclusion was that going after all of it was like chasing the wind. You can't catch it. It leaves you empty-handed and heart-weary. Think about it. This doesn't come from an atheist philosopher. It comes from inside the sacred text itself. The book is telling you, be careful. The carrot you're chasing might be an illusion. Because in the end, says the author, the wise man and the fool share the same fate. Oblivion. That stings, doesn't it? It's an uncomfortable truth. But it's also the doorway to something much greater. Because this suspicion, this feeling that we've been searching in the wrong place, is exactly what another man felt, centuries later. And that man turned it into a revolutionary philosophy. His name is Baruch Spinoza, the expelled Jew, the lens grinder, the solitary thinker whose ideas the powerful feared so much that he was banished from his own community at the age of 23. Why? For thinking too much, for refusing to stay silent. Spinoza looked at the religious world of his time and said the same thing as Ecclesiastes. They are chasing the wind. For Spinoza, The greatest deception was thinking that God is a being separate from us, a king on a throne, up there, looking down. Spinoza had a more radical idea, a bigger one. God is everything. God isn't above nature. God is nature, is the universe, is the laws that govern it. There is no God and a world as separate things. They are the same thing. You, me, the tree you see through the window, the star shining millions of light years away. All of it is a manifestation of that single infinite substance. If God is everything, there can be no external purpose. There is no boss giving you instructions from outside the system, because there is no outside. We are inside. We are part of God. We are a wave in the infinite ocean of existence. So if there's no external mission to fulfill, why are we alive? This is where Spinoza gives us the first half of the answer, an answer that seems simple, but changes everything. Spinoza said something that in Latin sounds complicated, but is really just plain common sense. Everything in the universe has a natural drive, to persevere in its own being, to keep existing, to express its nature to the fullest. A seed wants to become a tree, not because someone commanded it, because that is its nature. A river wants to reach the sea, not out of obedience, because of what it is. And a human being, by its nature, is a thinking and conscious being. Therefore, our deepest purpose is to understand the world, to understand our place in it, and to act in accordance with that understanding, not to blindly follow rules, to use our reason to comprehend the reality we are part of. Happiness, for Spinoza, is not a prize waiting at the end of the road. It is the feeling you experience when you live in accordance with your true nature, when you understand, when you see the connection between things. Now look at what happens when you put this next to Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes says, "Stop chasing the wind, the riches, the fame. It's pointless." Spinoza explains why. Because those things are external. True fulfillment comes from within, from understanding. Two voices separated by centuries and completely different cultures, shouting the same thing. Stop looking outward. Look inward. Here's an image you won't easily forget. The Bible, in its simplest version, gives you a map. Behave this way. Believe this. You'll be happy. It's a safe path, but it's someone else's path. Ecclesiastes tears that map from your hands, drops you in the middle of a desert, and says, "Find your own way, because the maps you've been given lead nowhere. Hard, lonely, but the first step toward freedom." And there, in that desert, Spinoza appears. And he doesn't give you another map. He gives you a compass. The compass is your own reason. Good is everything that helps you become more yourself, that increases your power to exist and to understand. Evil is everything that diminishes you, that fills you with sorrowful passions like fear, hatred, envy. The purpose of life is not to reach a distant goal. It is the very process of living in an active, conscious, and rational way. It's about stopping being a puppet of your fears and starting to be the pilot of your own mind. Every time you learn something new, you are fulfilling your purpose. Every time you overcome a fear, you are becoming more yourself. Every time you act with clarity instead of rage, you are moving closer to what you truly are. And this is where the Bible and Spinoza meet, where no one expected. In the New Testament, there is a line everyone knows: "The truth shall set you free." We've always interpreted it in a purely religious sense. Believing in Jesus frees you from sin. But what if its meaning ran deeper? What if it referred to truth with a capital T? The truth about reality, about who we are. Spinoza would completely agree. True freedom is not doing whatever you want. That's the slavery of impulse. True freedom is understanding why you do what you do, acting not out of fear, but out of clear knowledge, And this dismantles one of the great deceptions of our culture, that faith and reason are enemies. That to find God, you have to turn off your brain. Spinoza and the most honest voice of the Bible say the opposite. To find the divine, light up your mind more than ever. Because if God is reality itself, studying science, art, and psychology isn't turning your back on God. It's studying God directly. It is the most honest form of prayer there is. The deep answer comes down to 3 points. 1. We are here to be. The simple fact of being alive, of breathing, of experiencing the world, is already an end in itself. You don't need to justify your existence to anyone. You are a valuable part of the universe, a walking miracle. 2. We are here to understand. We are the part of the universe that has awakened and can look at itself. The more you understand, the more free and fulfilled you feel. Knowledge is not decoration. It is the path. 3. We are here to love. Not sentimental, passive love. Spinoza's intellectual love. The deep joy that arises from understanding the beauty of the universe and feeling connected to all of it. The same feeling Ecclesiastes describes at the end of all his bitterness. The best we can do is enjoy our work, eat, drink, be with the people we love. Not as a distraction, as the highest expression of being alive. This is the true purpose, not a mission to complete, a way of living. It's here and now, in every decision, in every thought you choose to cultivate, in your ability to be moved by a sunset or to grasp a complex idea. The responsibility is yours, and that is frightening. But it also gives you immense power, the power to be the architect of your own fulfillment. Life is not an exam you have to pass. It is a work of art you are creating at every instant. The deception is thinking that the canvas is in heaven. Spinoza and the wise man of Ecclesiastes whisper to you from centuries away. The canvas, the brushes, and the painter are you.